Between the start of the First Succession War in 2786 and its stuttering conclusion in 2822, a total of 146 star systems vanished from the maps, removed by Comstar's Safe Transit and Astrogation project. This courtesy service arose naturally as part of Jerome Blake's effort to reconnect the worlds of the Inner Sphere in the wake of Kerensky's exodus, and effectively amounted to an interstellar census displaying the worlds where enough human civilization existed to merit communication and trade. In 2824, 2 more worlds would bring the final tally of fallen stars to 148. The Death of Worlds, The First Succession War, page 107. The tragic story of Tyrfing, a planetary system roughly 44 light-years from Terra, is a roller coaster ride of unrealized promise, jealousy, and nearly unparalleled violence. Since its discovery in the early centuries of space exploration, the planet transitioned from backwater to provincial capital, then from bitterly contested prize to forgotten wasteland. Let us take some time to get to know the story because it's one that demonstrates just how willing some are to live that old line, "If I can't have it, no one can." When the system of 9 planets rotating around a stable yellow-white F-type main sequence star was first spotted, it was quickly added to the list of potential candidates for a habitable world. Upon further investigation, the 5th planet was found to be within the habitable zone and already had a significant amount of surface water broken up by 4 large continents. With 47% of the planet's surface covered in oceans, near Terran gravity, and an equatorial temperature of just 33 degrees Celsius, the initial observations were promising. It even had 2 small moons which had a stabilizing effect on the planet's rotation. Hope for quick colonization of the planet was dampened by the discovery that the planet's atmosphere was not hospitable to humans, as it had far too high a concentration of carbon dioxide and very little oxygen. If the planet, by this point named Tabit, would someday be a home for colonists, it would require terraforming. Seeking greener pastures, scientists moved on after marking the system down for further study and development in the future. The only permanent presence in the system was a way station placed at the zenith jump point, which could be used by jump ships passing through on their journey further from Terra. Eventually, with experience, technology, and an intense drive to take advantage of resources near Terra, the system and Tabit would get a second look during the early 23rd century. A couple of companies dug through the survey data for Tabit and noticed the high concentration of minerals found in readily accessible areas of the planet's continents. Ideas were hatched, papers were pushed, and accountants did, well, whatever it is they do. With the blessing of the always incredible and never corrupt Terran Alliance bureaucracy, Pacific Transstellar, or PTS for short, established several footholds onto the surface of Tabit. Claiming the choice locations for mineral extraction, PTS moved forward with industrial development. The goal of the production was to facilitate their shipbuilding operations. As a condition of granting the company the clearance, the Terran Alliance required continuing efforts by PTS to, quote, maintain and encourage the world's potential habitability. To meet this requirement, the company paid several agricultural firms to begin seeding the planet with a variety of plants and microorganisms which could take advantage of the carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere and increase oxygen. Available records suggest that the efforts at terraforming were not treated seriously, and most of the locations for the seeding of trees, grasses, and algae were carried far out from the best mining locations, rather than based upon the best opportunities for life to spread. Still, nature finds a way, and carbon dioxide-consuming life began to spread on the surface of the planet and within its oceans. The atmospheric oxygen continued to rise, and eventually it became possible for a human being to breathe unassisted in the lower altitude areas of the planet's surface. Once word got out that Tabit 5 was habitable, ships belonging to the agricultural terraforming company gradually started carrying more than just plant life. This was a time when the Terran Alliance was struggling to maintain control over humanity's spread across the stars, and the more the government tried to crack down on dissidents who didn't want to play ball, the more they sought to escape. Among shipments to Tabit 5, unregistered settlers and entrepreneurs began to arrive on the planet. Their goals were many, but most gelled around the desire to create permanent settlements. With the Terran Alliance's attention elsewhere, by the mid-2230s, the planet's settlements on the southern continent could boast of having about 90,000 residents. Most were concentrated into a series of hinterland complexes hidden underground or otherwise out of view of atmospheric observation. By this point, the rapidly developing jungle canopy aided in these efforts. Of course, we all know that as soon as something seems to be going well without any serious issues, someone gets bored and decides to muck it all up. For Tabet, it seemed that the mucking up took the form of the Outer Reaches Rebellion, which disrupted trade and communication across the Terran Alliance. From the perspective of those living on the surface of the planet, those supply ships ferrying goods into the system and mined or out started showing up late and then stopped showing up entirely. Details concerning what happened on Tabet after that are sparse. What is known is that the way station at the Nadir Point ended up being destroyed. It's likely that survival for the planet's inhabitants became a serious issue as the mining operations staff came into contact with the settlements in the southern hemisphere. How that exactly happened is up for archaeologists to discover and argue about, but this meeting between the peoples likely didn't go well. If the miners were starving and searching for food, running into settlements on the southern continent must have been a shock. With starvation being a powerful motivator, it doesn't take much imagination to guess what happened next. To the rest of settled space, Tabet was a backwater defunct mining operation. As the years passed, the system was dropped off of shipping maps and charts entirely. Over the course of the next 2 decades, it's presumed that the last of the original settlers and miners died out from the lack of food and medicine. Life on Tabet continued without human intervention for decades. When travelers rediscovered the system in 2350, they saw a world that was covered in dense green jungle and forests. There were no animals beyond microbes in the oceans, but that was all the better as there were plenty of planets in the inner sphere where dangerous creatures made life difficult. Settlers returned to Tabet 5, many of them tracing their ancestry back to Scandinavian countries on Terra. With new colonies came a new name for the planet and its system. Tyrfing was forged from the jungles of Tabet, and over the course of hundreds of years, the planet's human population thrived. Intense terraforming brought with it food production and animal life as well as economic growth. It wasn't long before these new settlers discovered the artifacts left behind by the miners and the Tabet settlers. Tyrfing enjoyed the benefits of the stability that the new Terran hegemony provided and even developed a tourism industry once gigantic crystalline formations were discovered in the Angantyr continent. These fields of massive crystals were described as sparkling in the planet's bright sunlight with a riot of brilliant colors. Some of the crystals were reported to glow in the early evening as the naturally occurring elements within their structures released built-up UV light. Tyrfing's success continued into the Star League years as the planet's abundant natural resources made it a perfect candidate for industrial and commercial development. Large factory complexes were built to quickly convert the planet's minerals into products that filled the holds of dropships that quickly spread across the inner sphere. It became so valuable that the planet became the provincial capital. Quite the rags to riches story, huh? You'd think this planet was a plucky adopted orphan with orange hair and wearing a red dress. At its peak, Tyrfing was home to roughly 3 billion people. SLDF presence on the planet, due to its role as a provincial capital, was extensive. 5 SLDF Castle Sprine were constructed across the planet's continents, and a space defense system was built in orbit to make assaulting the system far too costly for any fleet to run the gauntlet. This was all seen as a blessing for the residents of Tyrfing, who felt safe and benefited economically from the Star League's presence. Unfortunately, that blessing turned into a curse once Stefan Amaris seized control of the Star League. Amaris's forces were quick to take advantage of Tyrfing, including its space defense system. Tyrfing became one of the key components of Amaris's defensive ring around Terra. When Kerensky's 12th Fleet jumped into the system, the fight was costly. With wreckage of ships scattered throughout the orbit of Tyrfing 5, the dropships from the SLDF's 5th Army descended into what would end up being one of the most destructive fights of the war. Amaris's troops fought for every inch of ground and liberally deployed nuclear and chemical weapons against the SLDF, who responded in kind when the fights came down to the castle's brine. Each had to be taken, and it required use of nuclear weapons as well as orbital strikes from fleet ships to eventually crack them open. While much of the population was evacuated from the planet before the SLDF brought in the heavy guns, many millions remained and were left with the environmental and economic devastation wrought by these two armies. By mid-2777, Tyrfing's major cities and industrial centers were smoldering ruins, and the pollution from the weaponry and obliterated industry left vast areas uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. With such widespread devastation and risk of health, many residents on Tyrfing never returned to the planet. Still, some stuck it out, and with what had to be a hefty amount of stubbornness, people began to rebuild in the wake of the Civil War. Though obviously a shattered shadow of its former glory, Tyrfing was still seen as a planet with some value, so as the great houses began to gobble up systems following the collapse of the Star League, House Merrick made a play for the planet. The claim over Tyrfing was part of House Merrick's efforts to quickly revitalize their military and keep up with the other great houses, who were gobbling up systems following the collapse of the Star League. The Free Worlds League military had lagged behind the other houses, but in the 2770s and 2780s, increased funding had doubled the FWLM's size by the time Kerensky took his toys and fled the Inner Sphere. 5 SLDF regiments ended up joining with the House Merrick after refusing the Exodus orders. At this point, one might hope that history would cut Tyrfing some slack after facing not one but 2 human extinction level events. Well, I'm just crushed to report that the fun isn't over yet for our plucky planet, as the Inner Sphere descended into the chaotic destruction of the First Succession War. Due to a series of rumors with somewhat mysterious origins, leadership of each of the great houses were informed that Tyrfing still had vast stockpiles of Star League technology and battlemechs locked in industrial storage facilities in those old castles Brian. The rumors were stirred into action when gathered intelligence, which might have also been fabricated or embellished, showed that the Free Worlds League military and the Tyrfing system were actively trying to repair and reactivate the space defense system. If they were going through all that effort for a planet that was largely depopulated and not producing anything of industrial value, the rumors must be true. The storage site was filled not just with pristine battlemechs and tanks, but staggering amounts of ammunition. The stack of crates across the aisle was just one of hundreds. If the enemy went mad and relied on weapons fire to escape the ambush, the whole site might be destroyed. That would be a colossal waste of lives and precious material that all 5 houses hoped to claim. If these were Drac regulars, she might fear such a cataclysmic outcome. Knowing they were the usurper's former stooges, though, eased those fears. The Black Sharks might be despicable, but they were survivors. Renda in Waiting, Turning Points, Tyrfing, page 1. In July of 2788, raiding forces from both the Capellan Confederation and the Lyran Commonwealth jumped into the system and burned toward Tyrfing. A month later, the Federated Suns sent their own force to Tyrfing in an attempt to either claim the SLDF tech and gear for themselves or prevent others from taking it. Finally, jump ships bearing Draconis Combine markings jumped into the system in October, and it was on like Donkey Kong. The resulting conflict between all 5 of the great houses over Tyrfing piled even more destruction on top of the ruins of the previously prosperous world. Those who had survived the Emeris occupation and then the liberation and chose to stick around to rebuild were now beset upon by military units that sought to destroy whatever they couldn't claim for themselves. Those huddled in what was left of major cities were wiped away in fresh nuclear fire. The already largely ruined castles Brian were obliterated along with the house units that tried to occupy them. As Stephen Latt stated in his book Forgotten Battles of the Succession War in 2825, the number of skirmishes, temporary alliances, and inevitable betrayals that took place throughout the conflict is nearly impossible to determine, even 30 years later. The tragedy was compounded by the fighting between houses that spilled out into the nature preserves and natural crystal formations which had driven tourism to the planet over the years. Eventually, the crystalline formations were blasted to bits, forests were burned, and water features turned into mud bogs of rotting organic material and charred bits of metal and myomer. Control of land passed so frequently between the factions that later historical inquiries found it impossible to make heads or tails out of the sequence of events. A reinforced position might be defended by Free Worlds League troops one day, only to be pushed out by a new defender, which itself was wiped out in another offensive a few hours later. No matter the specifics, the end result was the same: much mayhem and death, and very little to show for it. The Great Crystal Valley Battle began in December of 2788, and it marked a new low for the great houses as each demonstrated a willingness to burn everything down just to prevent anyone else from winning an advantage. 9 weeks after that, the fighting still continued, but the signature Valley of Crystals was ruined. SLDF storage site TV-9, Tyrfing, Free Worlds League, 15 December 2788. It was discovered by accident. There weren't even records of its existence. Combat in the valley caused a number of rock slides which revealed a cunningly camouflaged entrance to the SLDF storage site TV9. It predated the battle against the usurpers' forces. Unblemished battle mechs and combat vehicles as far as the eye could see. Huge ammunition stores, vast caches of replacement weapons, limbs, cockpits, sensors, life support equipment, and every other conceivable component that might be required for a full regiment setting out in combat. But as with all else in the Great Crystal Valley, no secret stayed so for long. All That Glitters Scenario. Turning Points Tyrfing, page 16. Eventually, it all became an obvious farce. By February of 2789, units started to retreat from the surface of the planet. There was no point in declaring victory because there was nothing left to claim. Any remnants of Star League technology had long been either destroyed or made useless in comparison to the number of mechs and men obliterated in order to obtain it. The final units still on the planet's surface were from House Merrick. The Free Worlds League had maintained control of the planet, which no longer had any industrial, military, or cultural value. Captain General Kenyon Merrick cut their losses and ordered whatever they could to be salvaged, loaded onto ships, and carried out of system. Surprisingly, there were still about 5 million residents scattered across the ruined continents, surviving in groups and struggling. Merrick ordered aid to be brought in, but by 2824, Tyrfing was officially quarantined and declared a lost cause. Tyrfing was officially dead. History moved on, and the Tyrfing system was removed from many interstellar maps of the region. The Second and Third Succession Wars passed the planet by, even as those tiny pockets of humanity clung to life on its surface. When an interstellar expedition survey team jumped into the system in 3090, they unexpectedly discovered many small communities scattered across the habitable regions. The Tyrfing people had regressed technologically and were surviving through subsistence farming and gathering. There was no centralized government, and from what the IE was able to observe, the settlements largely kept to themselves. Those who lived up in the highlands tended to look down on the people who lived down in the lowland valleys. This discrimination was based upon an assertion that the lowlands were dangerous and the people who lived there were sickly. There were some settlements that were able to preserve technology like indoor electricity, firearms, and heating, but for the most part, these were not savvy peoples. Much of what they understood about technology was based around maintaining what they had rather than inventing or building anything new. One family group, known as the Ulsik clan, was said to have owned 2 intact operating Griffin battlemechs, but this strains the ability to suspend disbelief. The lowlanders tended to be worse off due to generally unhealthier conditions due to persistent industrial and battlefield pollution. Interstellar expeditions set up an observation site on Tyrfing to keep an eye on the happenings of the planet's locals, but as of the publishing of this video, there is no update beyond that 3090 expedition. This would be an excellent opportunity for an aspiring shrapnel rider, so get right on it. If you're interested in running a narrative battle or campaign on Tyrfing, the 2 sources I would recommend most are Touring the Stars Tyrfing and Turning Points Tyrfing. Those were both the primary sources for this video, along with the Liberation of Terra and the First Succession War sourcebooks. In Turning Points Tyrfing, there are special rules for the crystalline formations, including some crystals that have electromagnetic properties that can mess with targeting and tracking systems. It's worth checking out if you're looking for something new. In Turning Points Tyrfing, along with all the usual bits one would expect from a campaign book, I was struck by one of the commander profiles, and I want to give the character a little limelight. Rodrigo Sullivan was a colonel in the Free Worlds League military, and he was one of the principal commanders on the ground of the 5-way battle for Tyrfing in the First Succession War. By this point, Sullivan had risen in the ranks largely because he was a survivor, and he had a good reputation as a stoic who maintained his cool even in moments of intense stress. What most people didn't know was that Sullivan struggled with a lifelong stutter, which would re-emerge during stressful situations. He compensated by just keeping his mouth shut and acting rather than speaking out or slipping into a panic. This strategy worked out in his favor over and over through his career. Considered a veteran by the Tyrfing battles, Sullivan piloted his Marauder 1R well, especially in the chaotic heat of battle. Though not an expert mech warrior, Sullivan could be relied upon to always deliver accurate fire. It actually earned him the call sign DC, or Dead Center. The first recorded fight in the Battle of the Great Crystal Valley was the last one. After 6 days of crawling through tunnels, climbing over ruins, and sifting through rubble, all of the combatants were physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted. They simply wanted it to end, one way or another. In the end, it came down not to the fresher forces, but to those defending their homes. The Free Worlds League might have annexed the world only recently, but to the League troops fighting there, it was already home. Ollie Ollie Oxenfree, Scenario Turning Points, Tyrfing, page 21. Though the present conditions of Tyrfing in the mid-32nd century are unknown, the planet remains a cautionary tale. Far too often the fight over something ends up obliterating whatever that thing was. It's something to ponder when deciding how we want to find resolutions to conflicts. If you stuck around this long in the video, thank you for giving it a go. It's been too long since we covered a non-mech element of the Battletech universe, and this week seemed a perfect opportunity to dive in with Tyrfing. A very special thank you to all those on the Discord server who offered up their Free Worlds League mechs and tanks for the video. They're all so great, I'm glad to include them in the videos. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to make the YouTube algorithm happy and of course feed my insatiable need to see numbers go up on the internet. Going one step further and becoming a channel member throws a few bucks my direction and helps me justify keeping this little experiment going. I really appreciate it and take the responsibility placed on me seriously to keep producing content that is a little better each attempt. With that, I'll say have a great week, take care of yourself and others, and please go out and make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.